Hi, ladies and gentlemen. How are you today? Now I'm going to teach you how to answer the analyze the text questions. Know that whenever we read anything from the My Perspectives textbook, whether it's a short story or an essay, at the end of it, there's going to be several exercises that we're going to do. One of them is going to be the first read guide. Another one is going to be research. Another one is going to be some form of practice. And another one is going to be analyze the text questions. These are really important questions because it's a way for you to break down what you think the text means, which is very important. You cannot get this wrong as long as you're giving reasons and citing examples. Everything is fine. And as long as you're citing them correctly, you're going to be fine. So you've already done this, and I'm going to tell you how. You're going to use the RACE format. Allow me to present this to you now. Hold on one second, please. You're going to use the RACE format to answer your analyze the text question. And I know that you have used the RACE format for years and years and years. And it's simply, I'm gonna just say it out quickly because I know you know what it is, but then we'll go through it each one. RACE, first you're going to restate the question, then you're going to answer the question, then you're going to cite a quote to back up your answer, and then you're going to explain that quote. Very simple. I know you've all done this before. So whenever you come across and analyze the text question, you know that I am demanding that there be at least one quotation to back up your answer, and the quote's going to come from the story that we're analyzing. Also, and very importantly, please make sure you cite that quote correctly. In other words, put either the page number or the text name in parentheses afterwards. I'll go over that in a minute. So let's take a look at this. First thing you're going to do is restate that question. It's always best to do it in your own words if possible. Just break it down. But if not, you can restate it exactly the way it is. But if you can break it down a little bit into your own words, that makes it even better. For instance, if they ask you, what do you think the author meant when they said something? When you restate that question, restate it into your words. In other words, what do I think the author meant when they wrote this story or essay? Question mark, then answer it. I believe blank. So change it into your own words. 2, answer that question in a sentence or 2. I'm going to say it again. What do I think the author meant when they wrote this story? Question mark. I believe the author wanted to show you how fear affects people in a negative way. Period. I believe the author was trying to show us that fear really affects people and they can't stop it from happening. So again, you're going to answer that in a sentence or 2. Then the next one, you're going to cite a quote to prove what you just answered. So I would like you, please, and I have this down here, make sure you use one of the 2 following quote starters. Either consider the following quote or this is evident in the following quote. So I'm going to read this out to you. It says, consider the following quote. Quote, I was sick to death with that long agony. End quotes. And then notice in this example, this is because I have page numbers. If you have page numbers on your source, then you could just put the page number in parentheses after your quote. Now notice, I have quotation marks. I was sick to death with that long agony. Then I closed the quotes. Notice there is no period at the end of agony. I put the period at the end of the parentheses, which has the page number in it. So take a look. Consider the following quote. I was, quotation marks, I was sick to death with that long agony. Close quotes. Then I have a space. Then I have my parentheses, which I put page number 1. Then I close my parentheses. Then I put the period to show the end of this long sentence. Or, and this is an or, notice it is the same quote. I gave you a different quote starter. I said, this is evident in the following quote. I could have said, consider the following quote, and then said, I was sick to death with that long agony. Now notice, again, after agony, before the quotation marks, I do not put a period to close this sentence because this sentence continues on with my parentheses and my citation. So take a look at my citation in this. I put the title of the short story in quotation marks inside those parentheses, The Pit and the Pendulum. If your source does not have page numbers or we're not using it out of a book, you're using it from a story that you took off the internet, you can simply put the title of the story within those parentheses. You can also put the title of the website you took the story from within those parentheses. And then again, you close the parentheses and the period goes after the parentheses. So take a look. So this is evident in the following quote. Quotation marks. I was sick to death with that long agony. Close quotes. Then I have my parentheses. I have the title of the story in quotation marks because it's a short story. Then I close my parentheses and there's my period. Excellent. So again, cite a quote. Make sure you are citing it correctly. In other words, the page number or the title or the website goes in the parentheses after the sentence, after the quotation marks, and then the period goes after that. Okay, so we're 3 parts down. We have the R down. We've restated the question in our own words if possible. We have answered that question in a sentence or two. Then we cite a quote, and we start our quote by saying, consider the following quote, or this is evident in the following quote. So you don't just want to stick a quote in. You want to open up the quote by saying, look at this quote. Or this quote clearly fixes this or shows what I'm proving, anything like that. And then after we have cited it correctly, then it's time to explain the quote. So you want to start with this quote clearly shows. So in this case, I would say this quote clearly shows how fear severely affected the character, so much so that he felt sick to death. Period, and you're done with this. So again, analyze the text is simply following the RACE format. You restate the question in your own words. You answer that question in a sentence or two. You provide a quote and make sure you open that quote with a quote starter, something like consider the following quote, or this is evident by the following quote. You then give your quote in quotation marks. You then cite it correctly after the quotation marks. You put either the page number, the title of the source, or the title of the website into parentheses. And after the parentheses, that's where you put your period. And then lastly, you explain that quote. And you want to explain that quote by starting off by saying something like, this quote clearly shows, or this quote is a great example of. And then you explain what it clearly shows, whatever it is you're talking about. In this case, I would say this quote clearly shows how fear really affected the character in a negative way by making him feel sick, like he was dying, period, and I am done. Now, quickly, let's take a look at a sample. Take a look at what this student has done. This is for the story, Why Do Some Brains Enjoy Fear, which is on page 96. Notice, take a look at the first one. They restated the question, how can fear both be innate and learned? Then they answer that question by saying fear can be a lot of things for many people. And one that is the most common is being scared and learning from it, because in the future, if it happens again, you will know what to do and what not to do, or to get scared and realize that it's not that scary. So they restated it, they answered it. Right? The other, they're continuing to answer. The other is innate, and that means that it will help you by realizing it's fake or something like that. Then they give a quote to back up their answer. He says, consider the following quote. And then he gives the quote. Notice it's in quotation marks. Baby Albert, of course, is the exemplar case of this. This poor child was deathly afraid of white rabbits in the 1920s before researchers were required to be ethical. Then they closed the quotes. Now notice there is no period after the word ethical. Instead, they closed the quotes. Then they put in parentheses the number 93. Then after the parentheses, they put a period. That tells me that I can find that quote on page 93 of our book. And then lastly, they explain the quote. It says, in this quote, it explained how fear can be created at a young age and maybe affect you in the future. Take a look at question number 2. The same thing happens. What passage did I find most relevant? That is a restatement of the question. Clearly, the question was, what passage do you find most relevant? So they answered it. I mean, they restated it in their own words. What passage did I find most relevant? Then they answer that question. The paragraph that was the most interesting for me was paragraph 6. That is because it explains in detail how fear can work in one way out of a million. For example, in the following quote, it says, excellent. They then give a quote, which they quote start. Take a look. They do not put a period at the end of the quote. Instead, they put it after the end of the parentheses of page 93 to show us this came on page 93. Then they explain the quote. This quote explained how fear worked for this small child. Perfectly done. Take a look at the third question. Same thing. What has the selection taught me about portrayals of fear? So now I know what was being asked. I'm sure it was something like, what have you learned about portrayals of fear? They put it into their own words. What has it taught me? Then it answers the question. This selection has taught me a lot of things that I thought I knew, but I was wrong. That is because it talked about fear. Good. So it answers the question in a couple of sentences. Then he gives a quote. He says, for example, in the following, it says, boom, and gives you the quote. Notice there is no period at the end. Perfectly done. The period goes after the parentheses, after page 92, which shows me this came from page 92. Then it explains our quote. This quote explains how fear worked for some people by being traumatized, and then they are done. So I want to point out, let's go back to the RACE format. This is how you answer and analyze the text question. First, you restate that question in your own words. Then you answer that question in a sentence or two. Then you cite a quote that proves what you just answered, and make sure you open that quote with a quote starter, something like "consider the following quote," or "this is evident in the following quote." And then lastly, before we go on, make sure you cite that quote correctly. Notice you put in parentheses after the quotation with no period. Remember, the period goes after the parentheses, right? You either put the page number, you put the title or the website title. Good. And then lastly, you explain that quote. You explain how that proves your answer. So you say, this quote clearly shows how blank, blank, blank. And then you go from there. In this case, we're showing how this quote clearly shows how fear made somebody act negatively or stupidly in the story, The Pit and the Pendulum. Really nice job, everybody. Really nice job. Again, take a look at this, the race format. Last time I will show it. First thing you're going to do is restate the question. Then you're going to answer the question in a sentence or two. Then you're going to cite a quote, provide a quote from the story or the essay. Make sure you cite that quote correctly. Make sure, you put in parentheses at the end of the quotation, you put the page number, the title of the essay or story or the website title. And of course, make sure you introduce each quote by something like "consider the following quote," or "this is evident with the following quote." Lastly, you explain how that quote proves your answer is correct. And you always start with something how "this quote clearly shows," or "this quote proves evidence of," anything like that. Make sure you introduce your explanation with a starter. Very nice job, everybody. Thank you very much.